A man adopts the most unloved dog from the shelter, thinking he's just giving one broken animal a second chance. But only weeks later, he gets a shocking call that changes everything. This isn't just any stray. This dog carries a past darker and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Suddenly, the man who just wanted a companion finds himself pulled into a battle he never asked for, with enemies who will stop at nothing to get the dog back. Why was this animal abandoned? What terrifying secrets is he tied to? And when the fight turns deadly, can one ordinary man and one unwanted dog survive against forces far bigger than them? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty driveway as Clint Barrow carefully locked his front door. His footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete, each one a quiet reminder of the emptiness that had settled over his life since his father's passing 3 long months ago. The house felt too big now, far too silent, with only the occasional creak of old wood or the groan of the pipes to keep him company in the stillness of the evenings. Clint ran his calloused hand through his graying hair, the weary result of 38 years of life, labor, and stubborn hard work. His trusty pickup truck sat waiting at the curb, a faithful companion in his small handyman business. But lately even the familiar routine of fixing other people's problems couldn't fill the hollow void in his heart. Maybe it's time, he muttered under his breath, starting the engine with a heavy sigh. He'd been putting off visiting the local animal shelter, worried that bringing a pet into the house might somehow dishonor his father's memory. But the truth was, Dad had always loved animals with a gentle passion. Clint had grown up with dogs running around the family farm, and his father often talked about getting another one someday, when life was a little less busy. The Riverside Animal Shelter sat at the far edge of town, a modest brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence that enclosed the wide exercise yard. As Clint pulled into the small gravel parking lot, the sound of barking reached his ears, hopeful voices calling out for attention, for comfort, and for a chance at a brand-new home. Inside, the sharp smell of cleaning supplies mixed with the unmistakable scent of dozens of animals. A young volunteer looked up from her desk, offering him a warm, practiced smile. "Welcome to Riverside. Are you looking to adopt today?" "Just looking," Clint replied, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat quickly, feeling the words stick. "Been thinking about getting a dog." "That's wonderful." The volunteer, whose name tag reads Sarah, stood up eagerly, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We have lots of wonderful dogs here who really need good homes. Would you like to see them?" Clint gave a small nod, following her through a door into the kennel area. The barking grew louder, echoing against the hard concrete walls like a chorus. Dogs of every size and shape pressed eagerly against their cage doors, tails wagging, eyes wide with hope and need. Each one had a history, a story that explained how they'd ended up here, waiting for someone kind enough to give them a second chance. But it was the dog in the very last cage that caught Clint's attention. Unlike the others, this one wasn't barking or jumping for attention. The large mutt lay curled in the corner, simply watching them with wary, guarded eyes. His patchy coat was marked with old scars that told silent tales of a hard life. A handwritten sign on the cage read, "Bruiser." "Oh," Sarah said, noticing Clint's interest. Her enthusiasm dimmed. "That's Bruiser. He's not really adoptable. He has some aggressive tendencies." Clint stepped closer to the cage, studying the dog. Bruiser lifted his head, meeting Clint's gaze. In those dark eyes, Clint saw something that made his chest tighten. Not aggression, but pain. Loneliness. The same feelings he'd been carrying since Dad died. "What happened to him?" Clint asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. "We're not entirely sure. Animal Control found him about a month ago. He was in pretty rough shape. Looked like he'd been in fights, maybe used as a guard dog. He doesn't trust people much." As if to prove her point, Bruiser let out a low growl when Sarah moved closer to the cage. But Clint noticed something interesting. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on him, and there was no growl in his direction. "Mind if I spend some time with him?" Clint asked. Sarah's eyes widened. "Sir, I really don't recommend that. We have lots of other dogs who would make wonderful pets. There's a golden retriever mix in the front who's great with people. I'd like to try." Clint insisted gently. Something about this dog called to him. Maybe it was the way Bruiser held himself, proud despite his wounds, or maybe it was the flicker of hope he'd seen beneath the wariness. After several minutes of concerned protest and having Clint sign multiple liability waivers, Sarah reluctantly led them to a secure meeting room. She brought Bruiser in on a heavy-duty leash, keeping her distance as the dog moved cautiously into the space. Clint sat quietly on the floor, making no sudden moves. He'd learned patience from years of careful work with his hands, knowing that some things couldn't be rushed. Bruiser paced the perimeter of the room, occasionally casting glances in Clint's direction. "Hey, big guy," Clint said softly. "Looks like life's been pretty rough on you, huh?" Bruiser's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The dog paused in his pacing, studying Clint with an intensity that seemed to look right through him. "I know something about rough times." Clint continued. "Lost my dad a few months back. Been pretty lonely since then." He wasn't sure why he was telling this to a dog, but something about Bruiser's steady gaze made him want to share. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Bruiser took a step closer. Then another. Clint remained still, his hand resting palm up on his knee, an invitation, not a demand. The minutes ticked by in silence. Finally, Bruiser came within reach. His nose twitched as he sniffed Clint's hand, warm breath ghosting across calloused skin. Clint held his breath, waiting. The touch of a cold, wet nose against his palm sent a surge of emotion through his chest. Bruiser didn't wag his tail or show any obvious signs of affection, but he didn't pull away either. It was a small gesture of trust, hard-won and precious. "I'd like to adopt him," Clint said, not taking his eyes off Bruiser. Sarah, who had been watching nervously from the doorway, started to protest. "Mr. Barrow, please understand. Bruiser isn't a typical pet. He needs extensive rehabilitation, training. He could be dangerous." "Everybody deserves a second chance," Clint replied firmly. "My dad taught me that. Sometimes people and dogs just need someone to believe in them." What followed was an hour of paperwork and warnings. Sarah made sure Clint understood the risks, the responsibility, and the shelter's policy about returning animals if things didn't work out. But Clint's mind was made up. He saw past Bruiser's scars and growls to something deeper, a spirit that refused to be broken, despite whatever hardships had marked his past. As Clint filled out the adoption papers, his hand steady as he signed his name, he could feel Bruiser watching him. The dog had settled into a corner of the room, alert, but calmer than before. There was still wariness in his posture, but something else too, a tentative acceptance, perhaps even the beginning of trust. "Looks like it's you and me now, buddy," Clint said as he attached a new leash to Bruiser's collar. The dog stood, his movements careful but not aggressive. Together they walked out of the shelter and into the bright afternoon sun. Loading Bruiser into his truck was a delicate operation, but the dog managed it with surprising dignity, settling into the passenger seat as if he'd done it 100 times before. As Clint started the engine, he glanced over at his new companion. Bruiser sat straight and alert, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than what Clint had grown used to. This silence held possibility, the potential for something new. He thought about his father, about the lessons he'd learned about patience, compassion, and seeing the worth in things others might overlook. "Dad would have liked you," Clint told Bruiser as they pulled into his driveway. The dog's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but his eyes remained fixed ahead, watching their approach to what would become his new home. As they walked up to the front door, Clint felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not completely gone, but lighter. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Bruiser. Sometimes the best healing comes from helping someone else heal too. The key turned in the lock, and Clint opened the door to his house. It didn't feel quite so empty anymore. "Welcome home, Bruiser," he said softly, and together they stepped inside, two lonely souls beginning a new chapter together. The ancient truck's engine sputtered to silence as Clint parked in front of his weathered two-story home. He glanced at the large dog sitting rigidly in the passenger seat, its scarred face turned away, muscles tensed as if ready to bolt. Getting Bruiser from the shelter to the truck had been a challenge that left both of them exhausted. The dog had fought the leash every step of the way, and Clint's arms still ached from keeping hold. "Well, this is home," Clint said softly, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. He'd never seen a dog so defensive, so wounded in spirit. Bruiser's only response was a low growl, his eyes fixed on something distant. The first steps into the house set the tone for what would become their new normal. Bruiser refused to enter through the front door, backing away with hackles raised until Clint had to gently coax him through the side entrance. Once inside, the dog immediately sought out the darkest corner of the living room, pressing himself against the wall with suspicious eyes tracking every movement. Clint set down the supplies he'd bought at the pet store, a plush bed, stainless steel bowls, premium dog food, and a variety of toys. He arranged them carefully, trying to make the space welcoming. "See, all for you, buddy." But Bruiser wanted nothing to do with any of it. The food bowl remained untouched through that first evening and into the next day. The dog bed might as well have been invisible. Bruiser preferred his corner, or when Clint wasn't looking, the space under the dining room table. The next few days tested Clint's patience in ways he hadn't experienced since his apprentice days learning the handyman trade. Every morning, he'd wake to find new destruction, his work boots shredded, chair legs bearing deep teeth marks. Even his precious toolbox hadn't been spared from Bruiser's anxiety-fueled outbursts. Mrs. Henderson from next door came over to bring a welcome basket for the new dog, but Bruiser's reaction sent her scurrying back across the lawn. His barks weren't just territorial, they carried a desperate edge of fear masked by aggression. The incident led to a string of concerned neighbors suggesting he return the dog to the shelter. "He's dangerous, Clint," warned Bob Thompson from across the street, shaking his head. "That animal's got bad blood. You're asking for trouble." But each time someone questioned his decision, Clint thought of his father. Gerald Barrow had been the most stubborn man in 3 counties, never giving up on anything he believed worth saving. He'd kept their old furnace running through 15 Ohio winters when everyone said it was hopeless. He'd nursed their family car back to health more times than Clint could count, using nothing but determination and creative repairs. Dad would have given him a chance. Clint muttered to himself one evening, watching Bruiser pace restlessly by the windows. "And so will I." He developed a routine, moving slowly and predictably through the house. He talked constantly in a low, gentle voice, narrating his actions so Bruiser would never be startled. When filling the water bowl, he'd sit nearby, not making eye contact, just being present until the dog's thirst overcame his fear. The breakthrough came on day 7. Clint had been reading in his armchair, deliberately ignoring Bruiser, when he noticed the dog watching him with an intensity that felt different from his usual wariness. Clint's stomach had been growling, and he'd pulled out a sandwich from his lunch bag. Without thinking too much about it, he held out a small piece of turkey. Bruiser's ears twitched forward, but he remained in his corner. Clint placed the meat on the floor halfway between them and returned to his sandwich, heart pounding but face carefully neutral. Minutes passed. Then, with excruciating slowness, Bruiser emerged from his corner. His movements were stiff, ready to retreat at the slightest provocation. The dog's nose twitched as he approached the offering, and for the first time, Clint saw something besides fear in those eyes. Interest. Bruiser snatched the turkey and retreated, but Clint had to fight back tears. It was the first time the dog had willingly approached him, the first hint that perhaps there was hope. That small victory led to others. Clint began hand-feeding Bruiser, building trust one morsel at a time. The growling gradually decreased, though it didn't disappear entirely. There were moments, brief, precious moments, when Bruiser would relax enough to lay in the same room as Clint, though still maintaining his careful distance. 2 weeks after bringing Bruiser home, Clint was working at his desk, reviewing invoices for recent repair jobs, when he felt a presence beside his chair. Looking down, he found Bruiser sitting there, not touching him, but closer than he'd ever voluntarily come before. The dog's eyes, usually so full of suspicion, held something new, a tentative question, a fragile offering of trust. Clint kept perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Bruiser remained there for several minutes before silently padding away, but something had shifted between them. That evening, for the first time since his father's passing, Clint found himself smiling. Really smiling, as he watched Bruiser cautiously investigate the toy ball he'd ignored for 2 weeks. The destruction didn't stop completely, and there were still bad days when Bruiser's past traumas would surface in aggressive displays. But now there were good moments too, moments that made the challenges worthwhile. Clint began finding dog toys brought to his bedroom door in the morning. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, Bruiser would settle close enough that Clint could feel the warmth radiating from his large body. Each small sign of trust felt like a victory, a confirmation that his father's stubborn spirit had taught him well. Where others saw a lost cause, Clint saw potential. Where they saw danger, he recognized pain, seeking healing. In Bruiser's gradual transformation, he found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a purpose, a connection, a reason to keep going when grief threatened to overwhelm him. They were both works in progress, man and dog, each carrying their own scars. But in those moments when Bruiser would meet his gaze without flinching, when the dog's tail gave the slightest wag at his approach, Clint knew they were healing together, one day at a time. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm. Clint sat in his father's old recliner, watching Bruiser, who lay curled up on his new bed in the corner. The dog's chest rose and fell in peaceful sleep, a sight that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. A half-eaten bowl of kibble sat nearby, another small victory in their daily routine. The sharp ring of the phone shattered the calm. Bruiser's head snapped up, ears alert, as Clint reached for the receiver. The clock on the wall showed 9:35, too late for casual calls. "Hello?" Clint answered, his voice rough from disuse. "Is this Clint Barrow?" A professional, measured voice came through the line. "This is Detective Harris with the County Police Department." Clint's stomach tightened. He sat up straighter, instantly alert. "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" "Mr. Barrow, I understand you recently adopted a dog from the local shelter, a large mixed breed named Bruiser." Clint's eyes darted to Bruiser, who was now sitting up, watching him intently. "That's right. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly," Detective Harris said carefully. "But I need to inform you that this dog is linked to an ongoing criminal investigation. Would it be possible for me to stop by and discuss this with you in person?" 20 minutes later, Clint heard a car pull into his gravel driveway. Bruiser growled low in his throat, but Clint quietly shushed him. "Easy, boy. It's okay." Detective Harris turned out to be a tall man in his late 40s, wearing a practical dark suit that had seen better days. His sharp eyes took in everything, the modest living room, the scattered dog toys, the watchful Bruiser in his corner. "Thank you for seeing me so late," Harris said, settling into the offered chair. He pulled out a small notebook. "How long have you had Bruiser?" "About 3 weeks now," Clint replied, keeping one eye on his dog. "The shelter was going to put him down, said he was too aggressive." Harris nodded, making a note. "And have you noticed any unusual behaviors? Any extreme reactions to certain people or situations?" Clint thought about the destroyed furniture, the growling at neighbors, the slow progress they'd made. He was pretty defensive at first, scared, I think, but he's getting better. The detective's expression grew serious. "Mr. Barrow, what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear. Are you familiar with Dale Crenshaw?" "The junkyard owner?" "Out on Route 7. Everyone knew of Crenshaw's salvage yard, though most people tried to avoid dealing with its owner." "The same." Harris leaned forward. We've been investigating Crenshaw for months. What started as reports of stolen property has grown into something much bigger, an organized burglary ring operating across 3 counties. Clint felt his throat go dry. What does this have to do with Bruiser? That dog belonged to Crenshaw, Harris said quietly. He was used as a guard dog during break-ins, trained to be aggressive, to attack on command. The words hit Clint like a physical blow. He looked at Bruiser, seeing the scars in a new light. The dog met his gaze, and Clint saw not aggression, but deep wells of pain in those eyes. About 2 months ago, Harris continued, Crenshaw's crew hit a house in Marion County. They tied up the homeowner, an elderly woman who lived alone. According to our witness, they ordered the dog to attack her. The detective paused, his face grim. But he wouldn't do it. Bruiser refused to harm an innocent person. Clint's hands clenched into fists. What happened then? Crenshaw beat the dog severely, had his men dump him miles away. The shelter found him a week later, half dead. Harris watched Clint's reaction carefully. We've been trying to build a case against Crenshaw, but witnesses are scared. Physical evidence is hard to come by. This dog might be our best link to proving what's been happening. The room felt too small suddenly. Clint stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass. Bruiser followed him with his eyes, tail thumping softly against his bed. All those scars, Clint said, more to himself than Harris. I thought maybe he'd been in fights, or... He trailed off, remembering how Bruiser flinched at sudden movements, how he'd curl into himself when voices were raised. Dogs trained for criminal purposes usually end up one of 2 ways. Harris said, either they become permanently aggressive, or they break completely. Bruiser's different. He chose to protect instead of attack. That kind of loyalty, that moral courage, it cost him everything, but he did it anyway. Clint walked over to Bruiser, kneeling beside him. The dog lifted his head, pressing his nose into Clint's palm. All those weeks of patience, of gentle words and consistent care, they took on new meaning now. This wasn't just an aggressive dog learning to trust. This was a survivor healing from betrayal. What happens now? Clint asked, not taking his eyes off Bruiser. Officially, I'm here to inform you about the investigation and verify Bruiser's identity. Harris replied. Unofficially. I wanted to see how he was doing. And to warn you, Crenshaw has been asking questions about the dog. If he finds out where Bruiser is, he won't get near him, Clint said firmly. The protectiveness in his voice surprised even him. I won't let anyone hurt him again. Harris stood, straightening his jacket. Good. Keep your eyes open, Mr. Barrow, and if you notice anything suspicious, call me immediately. He placed a business card on the coffee table. Bruiser's lucky to have found you. Not many people would have given him a chance. After the detective left, Clint sat on the floor beside Bruiser's bed. The dog watched him with those soulful eyes, and Clint saw them differently now. Not the eyes of a dangerous animal, but of one who had faced evil and chosen good, despite the cost. You're a brave one, aren't you? Clint murmured, gently scratching behind Bruiser's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, a low whine escaping his throat. Standing up to those men, protecting that woman. No wonder you were so scared when I brought you home. Bruiser shifted closer, laying his head on Clint's lap, something he'd never done before. The trust in that simple gesture made Clint's chest tight with emotion. We're the same, you and me, he continued softly. Both a little lost, both needing someone to believe in us. He thought about his father, how he'd always said true character shows in how you treat those who can't fight back. Well, you showed your character, didn't you? And now it's my turn to show mine. The revelation of Bruiser's past could have been frightening, could have made Clint question his decision to adopt the dog. Instead, it strengthened their bond. Understanding bloomed where uncertainty had been. Every scar told a story not of violence, but of courage. Every growl masked not aggression, but fear of further betrayal. As the night deepened around them, Clint made a silent promise. He would protect this dog who had chosen right over easy, who had paid for his loyalty with pain but hadn't let it break his spirit. Whatever came next, they would face it together. News traveled like wildfire through their small Ohio town. By the next afternoon, 3 burly men in oil-stained work clothes pulled up to Clint's driveway in a rusty pickup truck. The gravel crunched under their heavy boots as they approached his front door. Inside, Bruiser's low growl rumbled through the house. Clint stood from his armchair, his heart pounding. He recognized these men from glimpses around Dale Crenshaw's junkyard. Through the window, he watched them swagger up his walkway, their confidence betraying the fact they weren't here for a friendly visit. The sharp rap on his door made Bruiser bark, not his usual defensive snarl, but something more fearful. Clint's hand rested on the dog's head, feeling tremors running through the muscled body. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I've got you." When Clint opened the door, he kept his foot wedged behind it, preventing it from swinging wide. The largest man, a thick-necked bruiser with a jagged scar across his chin, spoke first. "We're here for the dog. Belongs to Dale Crenshaw." "Bruiser's mine now," Clint said firmly. "I adopted him legally from the shelter." The second man, lean and wiry with tattoos crawling up his neck, sneered. "That mutt's Dale's property. Shelter had no right giving him away." "Dogs aren't property," Clint replied, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "They're living beings, and Bruiser's staying with me." The third man stepped forward, trying to peer around Clint into the house. "Listen, pal, you don't want trouble. Just hand over the dog, and we all walk away happy." Behind Clint, Bruiser's growl deepened, but Clint noticed something. The dog wasn't lunging or snapping. He was pressing against Clint's legs, trembling. These men had hurt him before, Clint realized. The thought made his jaw clench. "I know what Dale used him for," Clint said. "I know about the burglaries, and I know why Bruiser got dumped, because he wouldn't attack an innocent person. Shows he's got more humanity than your boss." The big man's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, friend. Dale doesn't take kindly to people interfering with his business." "I'm not your friend," Clint said, "and I'm not intimidated by thugs who abuse animals. Get off my property." The wiry man took an aggressive step forward, but the leader held him back. "You'll regret this," he growled. "Dale will hear about it." "Good," Clint replied. "Tell him Bruiser's found a real home, one where he's cared for, not beaten." They retreated to their truck, shooting dark looks over their shoulders. Clint waited until they drove away before closing the door, his hands shaking slightly as adrenaline coursed through him. Bruiser pressed against his legs, whimpering softly. Clint knelt beside the dog, scratching behind his ears. "It's okay, boy. They're gone. I won't let them take you." But he knew this wasn't over. Dale Crenshaw wasn't the type to let things go. The confirmation came 3 days later, just as dusk was settling over the hills. Clint was in his workshop behind the house, organizing tools, when he heard the distinctive rumble of a powerful engine. Bruiser, who had been dozing in the corner, lifted his head and growled. Through the workshop window, Clint saw a black SUV pull into his driveway. The vehicle alone probably cost more than his house. Dale Crenshaw stepped out, his bulk casting a long shadow in the fading light. Clint's throat went dry, but he squared his shoulders and stepped out to meet him. He'd known this confrontation was coming. Bruiser followed close behind, his body rigid with tension. Dale's expensive boots crunched on the gravel as he approached. Despite the autumn chill, he wore only a thin leather jacket over his t-shirt, as if to display the thick muscles of his arms. His face was hard, eyes cold beneath heavy brows. "So you're the one causing trouble," Dale said, his voice deceptively calm. "The handyman who thinks he can steal from me." "I didn't steal anything," Clint replied. "Bruiser was abandoned, left to die because he showed mercy." Dale's lip curled. "That dog was an investment. Trained him myself. Then he went soft at the wrong moment, cost me a big score." His gaze shifted to Bruiser, who was pressing against Clint's legs. "Still, might be worth rehabilitating, teaching him what happens to dogs who disobey." The casual cruelty in his voice made Clint's anger flare. "You're not touching him." Dale stepped closer, using his height to loom over Clint. "Listen carefully, because I'm only saying this once. That dog comes with me now, or things get ugly. I've got friends in this town, police, politicians, business owners. Cross me, and you'll find yourself without work, without support, without options. How long you think you'll last when no one in 3 counties will hire you?" Clint felt the weight of the threat. He wasn't naive. He knew Dale had influence, knew he could make good on his promises. But then he felt Bruiser trembling against him, and his resolve hardened. "I don't care who you know or what you can do to me," Clint said, meeting Dale's cold stare. "Bruiser stays. He's not your weapon anymore. He's family." Dale's face darkened with rage. For a moment, Clint thought he might attack right there, but then a calculating look crossed his features. "Family." Dale sneered. "You're a fool. That dog's not loyal to you. He's a killer, trained to hurt people. Soon enough, he'll show his true nature, and you'll wish you'd listened to me." "His true nature?" Clint said. "You mean like when he refused to attack that woman you had tied up? Seems to me his true nature is better than yours." Dale's hand shot out, grabbing Clint's shirt. Behind them, Bruiser exploded into furious barking. "You watch your mouth!" Dale snarled. "You have no idea what you're getting into." But Clint didn't back down. He knocked Dale's hand away, taking a step forward. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. I'm standing up to a bully who thinks he can hurt and intimidate anyone he wants. Well, not anymore. Not with Bruiser and not with me." They stood there, tension crackling between them, neither willing to back down. Finally, Dale stepped back, straightening his jacket. "You've made your choice," he said coldly. "Remember this moment when everything falls apart." He turned and walked back to his SUV, calling over his shoulder, "And keep looking over your shoulder. Both of you." Clint watched until the SUV disappeared down the road, its taillights glowing like angry eyes in the gathering darkness. Only then did he let out a shaky breath, the full weight of what he'd done settling over him. Bruiser pressed against him, no longer trembling. The dog's eyes were fixed on Clint's face, filled with something that looked remarkably like concern. Clint knelt down, wrapping his arms around the warm, solid body. "We're in this together now, boy," he murmured. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As they walked back to the house, Clint knew he'd crossed a line. Dale Crenshaw wasn't used to being defied, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But looking down at Bruiser, seeing the trust in those once wary eyes, Clint knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The autumn night wrapped around Clint's cabin like a dark blanket. Inside, Bruiser's gentle snoring filled the quiet living room where he lay curled on his new bed, a worn but comfortable cushion Clint had bought him last week. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight as Clint dozed in his recliner, a home repair manual open on his lap. A strange smell tickled his nose, pulling him from his light sleep. At first he thought it might be his imagination, but then the acrid scent of smoke grew stronger. Bruiser's head shot up, his ears perked forward and nostrils flaring. The dog let out a sharp, urgent bark that jolted Clint fully awake. "What is it, boy?" Clint mumbled, but even as the words left his mouth, he saw the orange glow through his window. His heart leaped into his throat. "Fire!" Smoke began seeping under the front door, thick and black. The crackle of flames grew louder, and the heat pressed against the cabin's walls like an invisible force. Clint jumped to his feet, his mind racing. This was no accident. Dale Crenshaw's warning echoed in his memory. "Come on, Bruiser," Clint called out, his voice rough with urgency. The dog was already on his feet, hackles raised. Together they rushed to the back door, but the handle was hot to the touch. Clint yanked his hand back with a hiss of pain. The smoke was getting thicker now, making his eyes water and his lungs burn. He could hear the hungry roar of the flames as they devoured the wooden porch outside. Bruiser pressed against his leg, whining softly. "The bedroom window!" Clint gasped between coughs. "That's our way out." They hurried down the hallway as the heat intensified. The smoke alarm finally screamed to life, its shrill warning almost deafening in the enclosed space. Clint's bedroom window faced the woods behind his property. If they could just reach it. The sound of breaking glass from the living room told him the fire had breached the house. Bruiser barked again, more urgently this time. Clint grabbed a blanket from his bed and wrapped it around his shoulders, then used his elbow to break the bedroom window. Cool night air rushed in, offering brief relief from the suffocating smoke. "You first, boy," Clint commanded, helping Bruiser onto the windowsill. The dog hesitated for just a moment before leaping out into the darkness. Clint followed quickly, the jagged edges of the broken window tearing at his clothes as he scrambled through. He landed hard on the ground below, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Bruiser was there immediately, nudging him with his nose until Clint struggled to his feet. Together they stumbled away from the burning cabin, watching in horror as flames consumed the only home Clint had known since his father's passing. The fire painted the night sky orange, sending sparks floating up like evil fireflies. In the distance, Clint could hear sirens approaching, but he knew it was too late to save the cabin. Everything he owned was in there, his tools, his father's old photos, all his possessions reduced to ash by Dale Crenshaw's cruelty. Bruiser pressed close against him, trembling slightly. Clint knelt down and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the rough fur. They were alive. That's what mattered. But the reality of their situation hit him hard. They were homeless, and Dale had shown just how far he was willing to go. "What do we do now, boy?" Clint whispered, more to himself than to Bruiser. The dog licked his face once, a gesture of comfort that brought unexpected tears to Clint's eyes. He had a choice to make. He could surrender Bruiser to Dale, try to protect himself from further retaliation. It would be the sensible thing to do. After all, the dog had already cost him his home. But as he looked into Bruiser's trusting eyes, he knew he couldn't do it. This dog had chosen loyalty over violence once before, suffering terrible consequences for his courage. Clint wouldn't betray that trust now. The fire trucks arrived, their red lights painting the trees in crimson flashes. Clint watched as the firefighters battled the blaze, but his mind was already working on their next move. They needed somewhere safe to go, somewhere Dale's men wouldn't think to look. An image flashed in his mind. Old Joe's barn on the outskirts of town. Joe had been his father's friend, and he'd offered help after the funeral. The barn was used mostly for storage now, but it would provide shelter while Clint figured out their next steps. "Come on, Bruiser," he said quietly, giving the dog's ears a gentle scratch. "We've got a long walk ahead of us." They set off through the woods, keeping to the shadows. The night was cool, and Clint was grateful for the blanket he'd managed to save. Bruiser stayed close, alert for any signs of pursuit. Every snap of a twig made them freeze. Every distant car engine caused them to duck for cover. It took nearly 2 hours to reach Old Joe's property. The barn loomed dark and silent in the pre-dawn light, its weathered boards offering the promise of sanctuary. Clint found the hidden key where Joe always kept it, tucked behind a loose board near the side door. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and old wood. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, casting strange shadows on the floor. Bruiser investigated their new shelter while Clint cleared a space among the stored furniture and boxes. He found some old horse blankets that would serve as bedding. As they settled into their makeshift home, exhaustion finally overtook them both. Bruiser curled up next to Clint on the blankets, his solid presence a comfort in the strange surroundings. Despite everything they'd lost, Clint felt a fierce sort of pride. They'd survived Dale's attempt to break them, and they'd done it together. "We're not giving up," Clint murmured, scratching behind Bruiser's ears. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor in agreement, and soon his breathing deepened into sleep. Clint stayed awake a while longer, listening to the night sounds outside the barn. His body ached from their escape, and his throat still burned from the smoke, but his resolve had never been stronger. Dale Crenshaw had tried to destroy them with fire, but instead he'd forged their bond even stronger. Like steel in a furnace, the flames had only hardened Clint's determination to protect Bruiser, no matter the cost. Detective Harris arrived at the barn just as the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. Clint watched through a gap in the wooden slats as the police car pulled up, gravel crunching under its tires. Bruiser tensed beside him, but remained quiet, a far cry from the aggressive dog he'd first brought home. "Mr. Barrow," Detective Harris called out, his voice carrying across the empty farmyard. "We need to talk." Clint stepped out of the barn, with Bruiser following close at his heels. The detective wasn't alone. A female officer stood beside him, her badge catching the early light. "Come to check on us?" Clint asked, trying to keep his tone light despite the exhaustion weighing him down. The past few days of sleeping in the barn had left dark circles under his eyes. Detective Harris shook his head. "We have a proposition for you, and for Bruiser." He gestured toward the barn. "Mind if we step inside?" "This needs to be private." Inside the barn, dust motes danced in the streams of sunlight, filtering through the weathered boards. Clint's temporary living space was sparse, just a cot, some supplies, and Bruiser's bed made from old blankets. The detective's shoes crunched on the hay-strewn floor as he paced. "3 nights ago," Harris began, "there was a violent robbery at the Miller family's farm supply store. The perpetrators wore masks, but we're certain it was Dale's crew." He paused, watching Bruiser. "And your dog was there before, when Dale owned him." Clint's hand instinctively went to Bruiser's head, feeling the rough fur beneath his palm. "What are you saying?" "Dogs have incredible memories, especially for scents." The female officer spoke up. "And Bruiser spent months with these men. If we could get him to identify them in a controlled setting." "You want to use him as a witness?" Clint's voice cracked with disbelief. Detective Harris nodded slowly. "In a manner of speaking, we've arranged for a scent lineup, similar to a visual lineup, but using clothing samples instead. If Bruiser can identify his former handlers, it would give us probable cause for arrests." Clint's stomach churned. But Dale would know. He'd know Bruiser helped identify his men. "We can protect you both," Harris assured him. "We've been building this case for months. Dale's operation isn't just about burglary anymore. We're talking assault, extortion, maybe worse. But we need something concrete to move forward." Bruiser pressed against Clint's leg, as if sensing his distress. The dog that had once been a weapon in Dale's arsenal now looked up at him with complete trust. Clint remembered the night they'd escaped the fire, how Bruiser had refused to leave his side even as the flames spread. "What exactly would you need him to do?" Clint asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The female officer stepped forward. "We'd bring him to a controlled environment at the station, present him with several clothing samples, some from suspects, some from uninvolved individuals. If he recognizes the scents from his time with Dale's crew, his reaction could help us establish probable cause." "And if he doesn't react?" Clint pressed. "Then we're no worse off than we are now." Harris replied honestly. "But Mr. Barrow, I've seen enough cases to know when an opportunity like this comes along. Sometimes justice needs a different kind of witness." Clint sank down onto his cot, and Bruiser immediately moved to rest his head on his knee. The dog's eyes, once so full of fear and aggression, now held nothing but loyalty. He thought about all the other victims of Dale's crew, the Miller family, the countless others who'd been terrorized, the next targets who didn't even know they were in danger. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Harris nodded. 24 hours. That's all we can give you. After that, the scents might be too degraded to be useful." He pulled out a card and placed it on a nearby hay bale. "Call me when you decide. Either way." After the detectives left, Clint spent hours pacing the barn. Bruiser watched him, following his movements with patient eyes. As night fell, Clint sat in the barn doorway, staring at the stars his father had taught him to navigate by. The old man's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing the hard thing, son. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat with Bruiser, running his hands through the dog's fur, feeling the ridges of old scars beneath. This animal had already shown more courage than most humans, refusing to attack an innocent person even when it meant suffering abuse. Now he had a chance to help stop the men who had hurt him, but it meant putting him back in their orbit. As dawn broke, Clint reached for his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the number on Harris's card. Bruiser sat at attention, as if he understood the weight of the moment. "Detective?" "It's Clint Barrow." He took a deep breath, feeling the magnitude of what he was about to say. "We'll do it. Bruiser and we'll help with the investigation." "You're sure?" Harris asked. Clint looked at Bruiser, who met his gaze with steady eyes. "Yes, it's time someone stood up to Dale. And maybe this is why Bruiser and I found each other, to make something right out of all the wrong that's been done." "We'll send a car for you in an hour," Harris replied. "And Mr. Barrow, thank you, both of you." After hanging up, Clint knelt beside Bruiser, taking the dog's face gently in his hands. "We're in this together, boy. Whatever happens." Bruiser's tail wagged once, slowly, and he leaned forward to press his forehead against Clint's chest, their own private gesture of trust. Through the barn door, Clint could see the sun rising over the fields, painting the world in shades of hope. For the first time since his father's passing, since before finding Bruiser, he felt the weight of purpose settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting one dog anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, about using their shared pain to prevent others from suffering. As they waited for the police car, Clint readied himself for whatever might come next. He knew there would be risks, knew Dale wouldn't take this lying down. But looking at Bruiser, seeing the quiet strength in his once broken companion, Clint felt ready to face those risks. Together, they would help bring justice to their small town, one cent at a time. Detective Harris adjusted his bulletproof vest as he briefed the small team gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. Clint stood beside Bruiser, his hand resting protectively on the dog's broad shoulders. The morning air was crisp, and fog hung low over Dale Crenshaw's sprawling junkyard. "Remember," Harris said in a hushed voice, "we're looking for concrete evidence. The stolen goods have to be here somewhere. Bruiser's our best shot at finding them." Clint nodded, his stomach tight with anxiety. The past week had been spent carefully preparing Bruiser for this moment. The detectives had used items from previous robberies to train him, and the dog had shown an uncanny ability to track specific scents. "You sure about this?" Harris asked Clint one final time. "We're sure," Clint replied, looking down at Bruiser. The dog's eyes met his, showing none of the fear that had dominated them months ago. "He wants to help. I can feel it." The team spread out, taking strategic positions around the junkyard's perimeter. Clint, Bruiser, Harris, and 2 other officers approached the main entrance. The lock had been cut carefully, allowing them to slip inside without raising any alarms. Towers of crushed cars loomed around them like metal mountains. The ground was a maze of muddy paths between piles of rusting machinery. Bruiser's nose worked constantly, taking in the countless scents. "Okay, boy," Clint whispered, removing a small evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a piece of cloth from one of the recent burglaries. They had chosen this particular scent because the stolen items, primarily jewelry and small electronics, would be easier to transport and hide. Bruiser sniffed the bag intently, his entire body becoming alert. His tail, usually held low, raised slightly, a sign Clint had learned meant focused determination. The dog began moving purposefully through the yard, weaving between stacks of vehicles. The officers followed, their footsteps careful and measured. Every few yards, Bruiser would pause, nose twitching, before choosing a new direction. After 20 minutes of tense searching, they approached a corrugated metal shed near the back of the property. Bruiser's behavior changed dramatically. His tail went rigid, and his muscles tensed. He looked back at Clint, then forward again, letting out a soft whine. He's got something," Clint whispered to Harris. The detective nodded, signaling his officers to take position. The shed's door was secured with a heavy padlock, but they had come prepared. One officer used bolt cutters to quickly and quietly remove it. Inside, the shed was cluttered with ordinary junkyard tools, hammers, wrenches, cutting torches, but Bruiser ignored all of it, moving directly to a corner where several large oil drums stood. The dog circled the drums, then sat down firmly, looking up at Clint and Harris. His entire demeanor screamed certainty. "Check behind those drums," Harris ordered quietly. Two officers carefully moved the heavy containers, revealing a section of concrete floor that looked slightly different from the rest. Upon closer inspection, they could see the edges of a recently poured patch. "Get the sledgehammer," Harris commanded. The concrete broke apart easily, being much newer than the surrounding floor. Beneath it, they found a cavity lined with plastic sheeting. Inside were dozens of carefully wrapped packages. "Well, well," Harris muttered, examining one package. "Looks like Mr. Crenshaw's been busy." The packages contained jewelry, watches, phones, and other valuable items that matched the descriptions from multiple burglary reports. Harris immediately called for backup and crime scene technicians. "Good boy," Clint said quietly, kneeling beside Bruiser. "You did it." The dog pressed against him, accepting gentle scratches behind his ears. His eyes, once so full of fear and anger, now showed pride and contentment. As the sun rose, the junkyard became a hive of police activity. Crime scene tape went up, and officers methodically documented and photographed everything. The evidence cavity yielded more than just stolen goods. There were detailed records of sales and shipments, creating a paper trail that linked directly to Dale Crenshaw. Clint watched from a distance as Dale was led out of his house in handcuffs, still wearing his pajamas. The man's face was a mask of fury as he was placed in the back of a police car. Their eyes met briefly, and Clint felt a chill despite the warming morning air. Harris approached Clint and Bruiser, looking satisfied, but tired. "This is big," he said. "The stolen goods alone are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. With the documentation we found, we can prove Dale was running the whole operation." "So it's over?" Clint asked, wanting to believe it but feeling uncertainty gnaw at him. "Dale's going away for a long time," Harris confirmed. "The DA's already talking about multiple felony counts. Between the burglary ring, insurance fraud, and animal cruelty charges, he won't see daylight for years." Clint let out a long breath, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. He looked down at Bruiser, who sat calmly beside him, watching the activity with alert interest. "Hear that, boy? We did it." The next few days passed in a blur of statements and paperwork. Clint had to document everything from his first encounter with Dale's men to the burning of his cabin. Bruiser was even officially recognized as a key factor in cracking the case, with Harris joking about making him an honorary K-9 officer. A week after the raid, Clint stood in the newly rebuilt section of his cabin, watching Bruiser doze in a patch of sunlight. The insurance money had covered most of the repairs, and friends had helped with the rest. The walls still smelled of fresh paint and new wood. "Just you and me now, boy," Clint said softly. "No more looking over our shoulders." Bruiser's tail thumped against the floor, but his eyes remained closed, completely relaxed. The change in him over the past months amazed Clint daily. The aggressive, frightened dog from the shelter had transformed into this confident, gentle companion. Clint allowed himself to imagine their future: quiet mornings working in his shop, evening walks in the woods, peaceful nights by the fire. After months of tension and fear, the simple dream of normalcy felt almost overwhelming, yet something nagged at him, a persistent unease he couldn't quite shake. Dale's crew had been extensive, and while their leader was behind bars, many of his men were still free. Harris had mentioned ongoing investigations, but no other arrests had been made. Bruiser suddenly lifted his head, ears perking forward. A moment later, Clint heard a car approaching on the gravel driveway. The dog didn't growl or show any signs of alarm, which meant it was probably someone they knew. It was Harris, looking more serious than he had since the raid. "Got a minute?" he asked as Clint opened the door. "Sure," Clint replied, feeling that nagging unease grow stronger. "Come in." The detective entered, giving Bruiser a distracted pat. "We're still building cases against Dale's associates," he said without preamble. "Some of them are proving difficult to pin down." Clint nodded slowly, understanding what wasn't being said. Dale might be in custody, but his network remained largely intact. The victory they'd celebrated suddenly felt incomplete, fragile. "I just wanted you to be aware," Harris continued. "Keep your eyes open. Maybe stay with friends for a few days if anything feels off." "I appreciate the warning," Clint said, his hand automatically finding Bruiser's head. The dog pressed against his leg, solid and reassuring. After Harris left, Clint stood at his window, watching the sun set behind the trees. The peaceful future he'd imagined just hours ago seemed to recede like shadows in the growing darkness. Beside him, Bruiser remained alert, as if he too sensed that their story wasn't quite finished. The victory they'd achieved was real. Dale's arrest would make a difference in their small town, but as Clint prepared dinner that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle while the war still loomed. He found himself checking the locks twice, making sure his phone was charged, listening more intently to the night sounds around the cabin. Bruiser settled into his bed near the fireplace, but his ears remained active, tracking every sound. The dog's instincts had proven trustworthy before, and Clint took comfort in knowing they would face whatever came next together. Detective Harris adjusted his bulletproof vest as he briefed the small team gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. Clint stood beside Bruiser, his hand resting protectively on the dog's broad shoulders. The morning air was crisp, and fog hung low over Dale Crenshaw's sprawling junkyard. "Remember," Harris said in a hushed voice, "we're looking for concrete evidence. The stolen goods have to be here somewhere. Bruiser's our best shot at finding them." Clint nodded, his stomach tight with anxiety. The past week had been spent carefully preparing Bruiser for this moment. The detectives had used items from previous robberies to train him, and despite his initial reluctance, Bruiser had proven remarkably capable. They moved through the junkyard methodically, Bruiser leading the way with his nose to the ground. Twisted metal and rusted cars cast long shadows in the growing light. After 20 minutes of searching, Bruiser suddenly stopped, his ears perking up. He began pawing at the ground near an old shipping container. The police brought in their equipment, and within an hour they had unearthed a cache of stolen electronics, jewelry, and other valuables buried in steel containers. Dale Crenshaw arrived in handcuffs shortly after, his face contorted with rage as he watched his empire crumble. Later that afternoon, Clint sat in Detective Harris's office, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as he signed his statement. "You did good," Harris said. "Both of you." Dale's going away for a long time. That evening, Clint drove home with Bruiser in the passenger seat of his weathered pickup truck. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and for the first time in weeks, Clint allowed himself to relax. He reached over to scratch behind Bruiser's ears, earning a contented grunt from his companion. "We did it, boy," he said softly. "We're finally free." But 3 days later, everything changed. Clint was driving back from a job site on County Road 23, a winding back road that cut through dense woods. Bruiser dozed in the passenger seat, and Clint hummed along to an old country song on the radio. He didn't notice the black SUV following him until it was too close. In his rearview mirror, he recognized one of Dale's men behind the wheel. Before he could react, a second vehicle appeared ahead, blocking the narrow road. Clint's heart hammered in his chest as he yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to squeeze between the SUV and the guardrail. Metal screamed against metal as the SUV slammed into his truck's side. Bruiser jerked awake with a startled bark. The impact sent Clint's truck spinning. He fought for control, but the vehicle broke through the guardrail and plunged down the steep ravine. Time seemed to slow as they tumbled. The world became a violent blur of sky and earth. Glass shattered. Metal crumpled. Bruiser's terrified yelp cut through the chaos. The truck came to rest on its side at the bottom of the ravine, steam hissing from the crushed engine. Pain lanced through Clint's body. Warm blood trickled down his face from a gash on his forehead. His left arm hung uselessly, likely broken. "Bruiser!" he called out weakly, panic rising in his throat. A whimper answered him from somewhere in the wreckage. The passenger door had been torn off in the crash. With agonizing effort, Clint unbuckled his seatbelt and crawled through the shattered windshield. Every movement sent waves of pain through his battered body. He could hear voices shouting from the road above. Bruiser emerged from the wreck, limping but alive. The dog pressed against Clint's side, helping him stay upright as they stumbled away from the truck. They needed to move, to find cover in the dense underbrush before Dale's men made their way down. 20 yards from the truck, Clint's legs gave out. He collapsed against a fallen tree, his vision swimming. The full weight of their situation crashed over him. His truck was destroyed. His phone was lost in the wreck. They were miles from help, injured and being hunted by men who wanted them dead. "I can't," he whispered, the words tasting like defeat. "I can't do this anymore." Bruiser whined softly and pressed his head against Clint's chest. The dog's eyes, once so full of fear and distrust, now held steady determination. Despite his own injuries, Bruiser stood guard, refusing to leave Clint's side. In that moment, something shifted inside Clint. He thought of all they had endured, the threats, the fire, the constant fear. He thought of Bruiser's courage in refusing to attack an innocent person, even when it meant suffering abuse. If his dog could show such strength, how could he do any less? With trembling fingers, Clint gripped Bruiser's fur. "Okay," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Okay, boy, we're not giving up." Using the fallen tree for support, Clint pulled himself to his feet. Pain screamed through his body, but he forced himself to stay upright. He could hear Dale's men crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. They needed to move. "Come on," he whispered to Bruiser. The dog pressed against his leg, helping him balance as they began their slow retreat deeper into the woods. Each step was a battle against pain and exhaustion, but Clint kept moving. They weren't just running anymore, they were refusing to be broken. Dale and his men had taken his home, had tried to take his life, but they couldn't take his will to fight back. Bruiser limped beside him, loyalty radiating from every movement. Together, they pushed deeper into the forest, leaving the wreckage behind. They were injured but alive, hunted but undefeated. In choosing to rise and move forward, they transformed their survival into an act of defiance. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they picked their way through the dense undergrowth. Clint's body ached, his wounds throbbed, but his resolve hardened with each step. He and Bruiser had come too far to give up now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The autumn wind whispered through the ravine as Clint pulled himself from the wreckage of his truck, every movement sending sharp pain through his battered body. The headlights of the vehicle that had run him off the road disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of Bruiser's concerned whimpers beside him. Blood trickled from a cut above Clint's eye as he assessed their situation. The truck lay crumpled against a tree 20 feet down the slope, steam hissing from its crushed hood. His tools and supplies were scattered across the forest floor, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Bruiser pressed close against his leg, alert and protective despite his own visible limp. "We're okay, boy," Clint muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Bruiser or himself. His ribs screamed in protest as he straightened up, scanning the road above them. Dale's men could return any minute to finish what they'd started. As Clint leaned against a tree to catch his breath, his mind raced through their options. They couldn't keep running forever. Dale's crew would never stop hunting them. The criminal had too much to lose with Bruiser's evidence threatening his entire operation. Each passing day brought another attack, another close call. It had to end. Bruiser's ears suddenly perked up, and he gave a low growl. Clint held his breath, listening intently. The distant sound of approaching vehicles broke the night's silence. Without hesitation, Clint and Bruiser scrambled deeper into the woods, moving as quickly and quietly as they could manage. They found shelter in an abandoned hunting blind half a mile away. As Clint tended to Bruiser's scrapes and checked him for serious injuries, his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from anger. He was done being the victim, done watching Dale hurt those weaker than himself. It was time to take the fight to him. "We're going to end this, boy," Clint whispered, scratching behind Bruiser's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the wooden floor in response, his loyal eyes never leaving Clint's face. Through the night, as they huddled in their temporary shelter, Clint formulated his plan. He knew Dale's junkyard intimately now, thanks to the police investigation. He understood the criminal's routines, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his arrogance. Dale thought he was untouchable, that his money and threats could solve any problem. That overconfidence would be his downfall. At first light, Clint made his way to a payphone outside a gas station, his muscles stiff from the crash. He called Detective Harris, speaking in hushed tones as he outlined his idea. The detective was hesitant, concerned about putting a civilian at risk, but Clint was adamant. "He won't stop," Clint insisted. "Not until someone stops him. Let me be the bait. You just be ready when he takes it." After several minutes of debate, Harris reluctantly agreed. They spent the next hour working out the details, timing, and backup plans. By the time Clint hung up the phone, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. Clint's next stop was a small hardware store where the owner knew him from his handyman work. The elderly man took one look at Clint's battered appearance and immediately offered his help. Within an hour, Clint had everything he needed: wire, tools, and most importantly, access to the store's landline to make one more crucial call. The phone rang 3 times before Dale's gruff voice answered. Clint's hand tightened around the receiver as he spoke, keeping his voice steady despite the hatred burning in his chest. "I'm tired of running, Dale. Let's finish this, tonight, at your junkyard. Just you and me." Dale's laughter crackled through the line. "Finally grew a spine, did you?" "Fine by me. Midnight. Bring the dog. He's coming home one way or another." "I'll be there," Clint replied simply, then hung up before Dale could respond. The rest of the day passed in careful preparation. Clint and Bruiser rested in the back room of the hardware store, gathering their strength. The owner's wife brought them food and first aid supplies, her kind eyes filled with concern as she watched Clint check and recheck his supplies. As dusk approached, Clint knelt beside Bruiser, running his hands through the dog's fur. "Whatever happens tonight, boy, we face it together." Bruiser responded by licking Clint's face, his tail wagging with unwavering trust. The junkyard was eerily silent when they arrived, 15 minutes before midnight. Clint parked the borrowed pickup truck well away from the entrance, not wanting to announce their presence too soon. The moon cast strange shadows through the twisted shapes of broken cars and machinery, creating a maze of darkness and silver light. Bruiser stayed close to Clint's side as they made their way through the familiar paths between the wreckage. They'd been here before during the police investigation, but tonight felt different. The air was heavy with tension, and every crunch of gravel under their feet seemed to echo in the stillness. They reached the central clearing just as the distant town church bell began to toll midnight. Dale was already there, standing confidently beneath the harsh glare of the yard's floodlights. 2 massive chains led from his hands to the collars of snarling Rottweilers, dogs Clint recognized from previous confrontations. "Right on time!" Dale called out, his voice carrying across the open space. "I've got to admit, I'm almost impressed. Most men would have tucked tail and run by now." Clint stepped forward, Bruiser matching his pace. "I'm not most men, Dale, and Bruiser isn't your property anymore." Dale's face hardened. "We'll see about that." He released the chains, and his dogs lunged forward, their powerful bodies coiled with aggressive intent. But Bruiser didn't back down. The dog that had once cowered at loud noises now planted his feet firmly, protecting Clint with a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. His past fear had transformed into something stronger, courage born of loyalty and love. The Rottweilers hesitated, sensing something different in their former packmate. Where they expected to find weakness, they found unwavering strength. The moment of uncertainty was all Clint needed. He whistled sharply. The signal. Floodlights suddenly blazed to life from all directions, revealing dozens of police officers emerging from their hidden positions among the junked cars. Detective Harris's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Dale Crenshaw! You're under arrest!" Dale's face contorted with rage. He reached behind his back, pulling out a handgun, but Bruiser was faster. The dog launched himself forward, a blur of fur and determination. His powerful jaws clamped down on Dale's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon with a howl of pain. The Rottweilers, seeing their master attacked, moved to intervene, but they never reached their target. Police K9 units burst from the shadows, quickly subduing Dale's dogs with professional efficiency. Within moments, Dale was face down on the gravel, multiple officers securing his hands behind his back. His curses and threats echoed across the yard, but they held no power anymore. As Harris read him his rights, listing charges that would ensure he spent decades behind bars, Clint felt the tension of the past weeks finally begin to fade. Bruiser returned to Clint's side, his tail held high and proud. Clint dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You showed everyone what you're really made of." Officers led Dale's Rottweilers away to waiting animal control vehicles, where they would have a chance at rehabilitation, just as Bruiser had. Detective Harris approached Clint, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and relief. "That was either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever seen," the detective said. "But it worked. We've got him dead to rights this time. Assault, attempted murder, the works. He's not getting out anytime soon." Clint nodded, still holding Bruiser close. The dog's steady heartbeat against his chest reminded him of everything they'd been through together, every obstacle they'd overcome. What had started as a simple act of compassion, taking in an unwanted dog, had led him to find strength he never knew he possessed. The morning after Dale's arrest dawned crisp and clear, painting the Ohio countryside in shades of gold. Clint stood on the steps of his friend Mike's borrowed porch, watching Bruiser investigate the dewy grass with newfound confidence. The dog's tail wagged freely now, no longer tucked between his legs, a sight that still brought a smile to Clint's face every single time. "Look at you," Clint called out softly. "Acting like you own the place." Bruiser's head lifted at the sound of his voice, those soulful eyes meeting Clint's with pure trust. It was hard to believe this was the same dog that had once cowered in the corner of a shelter cage, snarling at anyone who dared come close. The local newspaper lay rolled up by Clint's feet, its headline boldly declaring, "Local hero and former guard dog bring down criminal ring." He hadn't bothered to read it yet. The truth was, he didn't need to see his name in print to know what really mattered. Mike stepped out onto the porch, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Town's buzzing about you two," he said, passing one mug to Clint. "Can't go anywhere without hearing someone talk about how you and Bruiser brought down Dale Crenshaw." Clint accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, but shrugged off the observation. "We just did what needed doing." "Always downplaying everything." Mike chuckled. "You know, before all this, half the town didn't even know your name. Now you're practically a local legend." "Never wanted to be a legend," Clint replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Just wanted to give a good dog a chance." The truth was, the attention made him somewhat uncomfortable. Yesterday, picking up supplies at the hardware store had turned into a 15-minute conversation with strangers who wanted to hear the whole story. The cashier who'd barely looked at him for years now greeted him by name. Bruiser trotted up the porch steps, settling himself against Clint's legs. His fur had grown healthier over the months, covering most of his old scars, though some would always remain visible. Badges of honor now, rather than marks of shame. Insurance check came through. Mike mentioned casually. "For the cabin." Clint nodded. The remains of his burned home still stood as a charred reminder of Dale's desperation, but now it represented a fresh start rather than a loss. "Contractors coming out next week to look at rebuilding, thinking of making some changes this time." "Oh yeah? Yeah. Bigger yard for one thing." Clint reached down to scratch behind Bruiser's ears. Figure someone deserves more space to run around in. As if understanding, Bruiser's tail thumped against the wooden porch boards. The sound drew a memory from Clint of those first difficult weeks when any sudden noise would send the dog into a panic. Now, Bruiser lounged peacefully even as cars passed on the nearby road, secure in the knowledge that he was safe and wanted. Later that morning, they took their usual walk through town. The route passed the animal shelter where their story had begun. Sarah, the volunteer who had initially warned Clint against adopting Bruiser, waved from the front desk as they passed. "Still can't believe that's the same dog," she called out, stepping outside to greet them. Bruiser, who once would have growled at her approach, sat calmly at Clint's side, accepting her gentle pat with dignity. "He just needed someone to believe in him," Clint replied simply. Sarah's eyes softened. "You know, your story's made a real difference here. We've had more people coming in asking about our difficult cases, dogs everyone else had given up on. They say if Bruiser could turn out to be a hero, maybe these other dogs deserve a second chance too." The news warmed something deep in Clint's chest. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone, but the idea that their journey might help other unwanted dogs find homes felt right somehow. They continued their walk, passing Mrs. Henderson's garden where she was tending to her roses. Once she had complained about Bruiser's presence in the neighborhood. Now she straightened up and smiled. "Good morning, Clint." "Hello, Bruiser." She reached into a pocket and pulled out a dog treat. "May I?" Clint nodded, and Bruiser gently accepted the offering, his manners impeccable. Mrs. Henderson beamed. "Such a gentleman now," she said. "Hard to believe I was ever worried about him. You know, I told my daughter about you two. She's thinking of adopting from the shelter herself." "That's great," Clint replied, meaning it. Every adopted dog was another life changed, another chance at happiness given. They walked on, passing the construction site where Clint would start work next week. His tools had been replaced thanks to the insurance money, and he was looking forward to getting back to his normal routine. Well, almost normal. Everything had changed, really, but in the best possible way. At the park, they stopped to rest on their favorite bench. Bruiser lay at Clint's feet, watching children play nearby without any sign of his former anxiety. A young girl waved at them, and Bruiser's tail wagged in response. Clint thought about his father then, wondering what he would have made of all this. He could almost hear the old man's voice. "Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as problems, son." How right he had been. The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they finally headed home, or rather to Mike's place, their temporary home until the cabin was rebuilt. Bruiser walked beside him, no leash needed anymore, their steps naturally in sync. A police car passed them, and Officer Martinez gave them a friendly honk. The investigation was officially closed now, with Dale and his entire crew behind bars. The evidence found at the junkyard, combined with testimony from Dale's former associates, had ensured lengthy sentences for everyone involved. Back at Mike's, Clint settled into the porch swing with his dog beside him. Bruiser's head rested on his lap, a comforting weight that had become as natural as breathing. The future stretched out before them, full of simple pleasures. Walks in the woods, quiet evenings together. The satisfaction of honest work. "You know something, boy," Clint said softly, running his hand along Bruiser's back. "Everyone thinks you're the lucky one, getting a second chance and all, but truth is, I'm the fortunate one. You showed me what real courage looks like." Bruiser looked up at him with those understanding eyes, and Clint felt that familiar surge of gratitude. Here was his answer to loneliness, his partner in courage, his reason to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. On the road, cars passed carrying people home from work. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful, the kind of moment that could seem unremarkable if you didn't know the story behind it, if you couldn't appreciate how precious such simple peace could be. Clint didn't need the newspaper headlines or the town's recognition to know what he and Bruiser had accomplished. The real victory wasn't in bringing down Dale's criminal empire or becoming local heroes. It was in this moment, in the quiet trust between man and dog, in the knowledge that neither of them would ever feel unwanted again. As twilight settled over the town, Bruiser shifted closer, pressing against Clint's side. Together they watched the stars begin to appear. Two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed: loyalty, courage, and the kind of love that transforms lives. The evening air carried the scent of approaching spring, of new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring another day of ordinary miracles, another chance to appreciate the extraordinary bond they shared. For now they sat together in comfortable silence, guardians of each other's hearts, proof that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism begin with a simple choice to believe in someone everyone else has given up on. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.